Welcome back to our final and fourth installment of Islam, World Religion, Political and Military System. We are going to finish up with part three, talking about the spread of Islam, and we're going to move from the politicalization of Islam to the present time. The politicalization of Islam. Green is associated with paradise in the Quran and is supposedly Muhammad's favorite color, which is the reason why I picked this beautiful picture. In this 12th century, it was chosen as a dynastic color by the Shiites as opposed to black by the Sunnis. And if you look at the flags of Muslim countries, you will often see green, you'll see red, you'll see white, and you'll see black. I'd say the most common, just going from memory. Muhammad took political laws which governed 7th century Arabia and made them into the laws of Allah. Islam is a religious system, a political system, and a military system. This is very important to understand. You cannot divorce one from the other. According to Federer, who did an excellent DVD series that I would highly recommend, the political system is in two camps. One, the radicals, who must use violence to get the world to submit, and two, the moderates that believe that submission will happen eventually. And Federer goes on to say in the next bullet, because radicalism seems to be working, some moderates are moving to the radical side. But this last bullet is mine. Many are engaging in cultural jihad as seen in Western Europe and in the United States through immigration and high birth rates. One of Bauer's themes, another book in my bibliography that I would recommend, is this exact issue. And you can also look at statistics and statistics and marriage customs, which I'm actually not sure if it's pages 5 and 6 from part 4 or if it's from my original part 1. I apologize for that. A present day example of cultural jihad, perhaps in the United States, is just simply the fact that we now have or have had 4 elected representatives in our Congress who are Muslim. Our first Muslim representative was Keith Ellison, Democrat from Minnesota, elected in 2006. We have Andre Carson, Democrat from Indiana, elected in 2008. And in the current political atmosphere and well known, I'm sure, to everyone as part of the squad, we have Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, Democrat, elected in 2018, and Rashida Tlaib, Democrat from Michigan, also elected in 2018. Jihad. This is a screenshot from an online ISIS magazine that I have mentioned a couple of times in previous parts of this series on Islam. The tagline of this magazine reads, "O Muwajahideen, rejoice, for by Allah we will not rest from our jihad except beneath the olive trees of Rumaiyah, Rome." And this is important because Mujahideen are going to be our jihadi warriors. And they're not going to rest until they get themselves all the way to Rome and can rest beneath the olive trees. Now, I take this, and I certainly could be wrong in this interpretation, but I take this to mean that they need to conquer Christianity, because most people look at Rome and the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, as the center of Christianity. We as biblical evangelical Christians don't do that, but I think the world does look at it that way. You'll also notice just below the picture in the italics, I have dated Muharram 1438, and then I have in parentheses October 2016. That's because the Muslims use the Islamic calendar for their dating, and they begin their year either 0 or 1, I don't know which, with the Hijra, and that's when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina with his very few followers at that point. And then I've translated that into October of 2016 for those of us in the West. And as I said, this is a screenshot. It's from, the magazine is called Rumaiyah, which means Rome. It's issue number 2, and it's the English version. It's a very slick magazine, I might tell you. News with which we are familiar. I'm just going to explain a few things as a precursor to talking about this ISIS magazine. News with which we are familiar. We are sadly aware of the events concerning Islam clashing with the West, and I did this entirely from memory. So we have in 1979 to 1981 the taking of the American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran. And then we have in 1990, 1991, the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, when Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and first President George Bush went in to rout them out. In 1993, we have the first World Trade Center bombing. And then we have the infamous 9/11 2001, when the World Trade Center was attacked by two commercial jets. The Pentagon was hit, and a commercial plane went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And we have the war in Afghanistan, which began in 01 and is continuing, and Iraq began in 03 and is continuing. We have the war in Syria that began in 2017 and is continuing, and the areas of the Middle East and Northern Africa that are also in great turmoil because of jihad. And then we have numerous jihadi attacks just in general around the United States and around the world. And I should say in the United States and around the world. And a little bit later, we're going to see a graphic from this ISIS magazine that will highlight some of these lesser attacks that we don't hear about in the Western news. This is an event with which you may not be familiar, the Barbary Pirates. And please bear with me. It's a little bit of verbiage, but it's intensely interesting and something I certainly was only slightly aware of. In 1785, now this would be, we're a pretty new country at this point. 1776 is kind of the date we use, I think, for the beginning of our country as the United States of America. In 1785, Muslim pirates from North Africa called Barbary captured two American ships and enslaved their crews. To ransom them and establish peaceful relations, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, ambassadors to France and England respectively, met with Tripoli's ambassador to Britain, Abdul Rahman Adja. Following this diplomatic exchange, Jefferson and Adams wrote the following in a letter to Congress dated March 28, 1786. And the ellipses mean I've cut out some verbiage to shorten it out a little bit, but I have not changed the meaning. We made some inquiries of the Barbary pirates' pretensions to make war upon nations who had done them no injury. The ambassador answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet. It was written in their Koran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves as of all they could take as prisoners, that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. Quoting American historian Robert Davis, it should be noted that centuries before setting their sights on American vessels, the Barbary states of Muslim North Africa, specifically Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis, had been thriving on the slave trade of Christians abducted from virtually every corner of coastal Europe. These raids were so successful that, between 1530 and 1780, there were almost certainly 1 million, and quite possibly as many as 1.25 million white European Christians enslaved by the Muslims of the Barbary coast. The punishment these European slaves received for real or imagined offenses beggared description. If they speak against Muhammad, blasphemy, they must become Mohammedans or be impaled alive. If they profess Christianity again after having changed to the Mahometan, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, persuasion, they are roasted alive as apostates, or thrown from the city walls and caught up on large sharp hooks on which they hang until they expire. Congress initially settled on emulating the Europeans and paying off the terrorists. When Muslim pirates from Algiers captured 11 more American merchant vessels in 1794, the Naval Act was passed and a permanent U.S. naval force established. But because the first war vessels would not be ready until 1800, American jizya payments, which took up 16% of the federal budget, began to be made to Algeria in 1795. In return, over 100 American sailors were released. How many died or disappeared is unclear, and the Islamic sea raids formally ceased. American payments and gifts over the following years caused the increasingly emboldened Muslim pirates to respond with increasingly capricious demands. So I hope you notice that this is where our U.S. Navy began. Its inception was because of this problem that we were having with the Barbary pirates and them enslaving our crews. Finally, Thomas Jefferson refused to make increased payments. Denied jizya from the infidels, Tripoli proclaimed jihad on the United States on May 10th, 1801. But by now, America had 6 war vessels, which Jefferson deployed to the Barbary coast. For the next 5 years, the U.S. Navy warred with the Muslim pirates, making little headway and suffering some setbacks. Finally, William Eaton, U.S. Consul to Tunis, 1797 to 1803, entered the scene. He had lived among and understood the region's Muslims well. He devised an over-the-land approach to freeing the captives and was successful in 1805. The U.S. Marine Hymn celebrates this juncture in our history. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our country's battles in the air, on land, and sea. And I'm sure everyone here, Marine or not, is very familiar with those lyrics. Back now to our ISIS magazine. This is jihad from an ISIS point of view, quoted from the Rumaya online magazine. When mentioning the obligation of jihad for his cause, Allah indicated that some people would have reservations toward this noble commandment. He said, "Fighting has been enjoined upon you while it contains that which you dislike." Al-Baqarah 2:16. He then reminded the believers to place their trust in him by deferring to his infinite wisdom instead of relying upon their limited knowledge. But perhaps you dislike a thing that is good for you, and perhaps you love a thing that is bad for you. And Allah knows, while you know not. Al-Baqarah 2:16. He further taught them that if it were not for jihad, the world would be filled with corruption. And if it were not for Allah curbing people by means of others, the earth would become corrupt. But Allah has much bounty for the creation. Al-Baqarah 2. 2 is my translation of Al-Baqarah. It's the second surah, the second chapter of the Quran, verse 251. And where you see that little square with the question mark in it, I have a note down below that it's where there's an Arabic symbol that this program was unable to replicate. I couldn't even paste it in. It wouldn't allow me to do it. But it's an Arabic symbol that looks like Arabic script. And it means something to the effect of, all glory belongs to him. He is the most exalted, the most high. And you've probably heard Muslims on television being interviewed. And when they say the word Muhammad or Allah, they always add this little phrase to the end of Allah. It's one kind of a phrase, and after Muhammad, it's another kind of a phrase, sort of giving him praise and honor. So now we're going to take a look, quote unquote, through this ISIS online magazine. Following the previous quote, much time is spent telling of men who would fail to live up to this lofty obligation. They would remain behind, making excuse after excuse, despite the clear signs placed before them, as if implying that jihad no longer exists. So where the previous page is sharing with the idea that all men, all Islamic men, need to be engaged in jihad, this is now speaking against those Islamic men who have chosen not to or simply refuse to engage in jihad. The next bullet says, Muhammad refutes the position of these men, and Jibril, the angel Gabriel, does also. The sword must be taken up against the enemies of Allah. And then the next thing is 9/11, the bombings of Mombasa, Kenya, and San Bernardino, California are all mentioned as attacks against the Crusader nation. And the Crusader nation is, it's the United States. I've written it right there. This is the bottom 1/3 of a graphic that's in this magazine. And this is the one I was telling you about that would tell us of some smaller jihadi attacks that we don't hear about here in the West. And you can sort of trace them from the blood coming from the tip of the knife backwards. We have a Hindu temple curator who's critically wounded. Note the date is done in Islamic, with the Islamic calendar. And back from that is a Hindu killed by a knife. And back for that, we have an operation on a restaurant by 5 mujahideen with light weapons. Grenades and knives leaves 22 crusaders killed and more than 50 injured. And we continue on. We have a Buddhist party leader killed by the knife and on through. So it's not just Jews and and Christians who are attacked. They've got Hindus also attacked because they're non-Muslim. The issue goes on to display the cutting weapon of choice, a curved knife, and instructions as how to wield it effectively. Then there's a lesson from the Quran, and then there's a photo of a man helping a boy of about 3 or 4 years of age wearing the headband of a jihadi to hold a toy assault rifle. Then we have a series of quotes promoting good character, American soldiers crying over the loss of a fellow soldier. It's a photograph, a graphic on the horrors of hell, and I went no further than this. A jihadi cutting off the head of a man, and then a neat row of headless bodies with their heads carefully displayed on their torsos. I don't know how much more of the magazine is online, but I could barely do this. I could go no further than this point. So, talking about the ISIS online magazine, you can see what's out there for the public, and you can see why we have Westerners and Americans who are joining the jihad, because it's a very slick magazine. It's beautifully done, I must say. I mean, I didn't really express that exactly correctly. It's very slickly done. It's very professional. It's very well written. So we'll move on to this slide. Other views of jihad. Jihad means to struggle, to strive. It is not a holy war. And this is according to Sam, whom I interviewed. And again, if you send me an email, I will send you my interview with him. Two main additional views, which may or may not be coupled with jihad by the sword. We have inner jihad, which is the inner struggle to obey Allah. And we have cultural jihad, which is taking over a culture by populating it, using that culture against itself. For example, the United States' freedom of religion and the West's freedom for almost anything, and ultimately conquering the culture of the nation. And then my note down below is that freedom in the West has become license, abhorrent to both Muslims and Christians. We talked about Ummah Wahada earlier, and this is very interesting. It comes from the Quran, chapter 3, verse 110. Muhammad created the first Ummah. It's a word found 62 times in the Quran, when he crossed tribal and ethnic lines, uniting many disparate peoples under Islam and its prophet. He talked about this really early on because as he was conquering tribes, both by the sword and by persuasion, he was bringing them together as a unit under the banner of Islam. It's much like Christianity, where you can meet a brother in Kenya and a sister in France and a brother in Asia, and you can sit down, if you all speak English, and have a wonderful conversation in the Lord because you're connected by Jesus Christ. And it's a similar concept here, only in this case we have a situation where we have, because they've united under Islam, then they're creating this Ummah Wahada. We're going to tie this into the United States here in a moment. Islam distinguishes itself from paganism, Judaism, and Christianity. Once Muhammad conquered Mecca upon his return from the Hijra, that flight to Medina. Prescription: to worship Allah alone in a guided community. That's kind of the concept. That feuding among Muslims is forbidden, and transformation of the world through action is required. The Muslim American Society's Philadelphia chapter and the Leaders Academy. This was in the news quite recently. I would say this is August, and I would say probably in May of this year, which is 2019. Note the one, I'm going to show you the picture in a second. Note the one Ummah sign in the background and one of the photos. Let me show you the picture. In the upper left-hand corner, in the upper left-hand portion of that picture, you'll see one Ummah, and you'll see the children are saying, "The blood of martyrs protects us. Paradise needs real men." This is a Philadelphia school. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the children reciting, "We will chop off their heads." So this is what's going on in this country. And I'm not saying it's in every mosque, and I'm not saying it's in every Muslim school, but it certainly is there and is a factor and is a serious problem and concern. The evangelism of Muslims, which we talked about in part 2 at the end, but I want to go over it one more time, please. I think it's very important. There's no easy or quick route for winning Muslims to Christ. By now, that should be very clear to you if it wasn't already. Um, we need to be able to befriend them and love them and share Christ with them slowly and carefully. As I was preparing this slideshow, I contacted a person that I correspond with by email from England, and I said to him, I just can't find anything positive, and it's sort of disturbing. Is there anything positive? And he said to me, well, no, there really isn't. And so I thought, well, I had heard that there were some things that Muslims had contributed to the West in terms of their learning. And so I just have a page or two here that will just share a few positive things so we can end on a note that maybe isn't quite as disturbing. Contributions to the West during the High Middle Ages, which are about the years 1000 to 1250, while Europe was locked in the Dark Ages following the collapse of the Roman Empire. We have translations of Greek texts into Arabic and then to Latin in areas of astronomy, mathematics, science, and medicine. We have original innovations in arts, agriculture, alchemy, medicine, music, and pottery. We use Hindu Arabic numerals, 0 through 9, and the inclusion of 0 is significant. This came from the Arabics. They contributed to English language with the words alchemy, the forerunner of chemistry, algebra, algorithm, sugar, camphor, cotton, coffee, azimuth, zenith, 0, plus the names of a number of stars. Public libraries. During the 11th to 12th centuries, many Christian scholars attended Muslim centers of higher learning to study medicine. Many surgical tools were invented, philosophy, cosmology, navigation, and more. Christian scholars actually, during our Dark Ages, traveled, to the Middle East and gained information and brought it back. And part of what helped us to get out of the Dark Ages, as I understand it, was some of this knowledge that came back. It was, I believe it was called the Golden Age of Islam, and it was fairly short-lived, as I understand it. Also, it was roughly in these 11th and 12th centuries, and you might remember those are also the centuries where the Crusades took place, when the Roman Catholic Church decided it was time to take back the Holy Land for Christianity. Agriculture: artichoke, spinach, aubergine. Some came by way of China. We have arts and music. Rebek is an ancestor of the violin. The oud is one of several precursors to the guitar. Coffee is native to Ethiopia. Muslim Arabs developed it into what we know today, and Sufis drank it to stay awake for prayer. This all came from Wikipedia, and the Huffington Post also had an article on the contributions to society. Suggestions back to our evangelism, suggestions from Christian evangelists working among Muslims. And I think knowing that there were some contributions here is a good thing. We perhaps could find a little bit of common ground to talk to them about. So, as we said in part 2, we need much prayer. We need a consistent life of demonstrated ethics. We need to behave like Christians and not just have it come out of our mouths, but they need to see it in our lives. We need a solid doctrinal base. We need the ability to give a reasoned and loving presentation of the facts of man's fall and the gospel, a knowledge of Islamic belief and counter arguments. And the point here is that you make an argument for Christianity, they counter that argument, and you need to have an answer to that counter argument for them. The use of illustrations because of the Arab mindset, and I have recommended again in part 2 in the Land of the Blue Burqas. This lady does a superb job of using illustrations, taking biblical stories, tweaking them a little bit to help the Arab to understand what's being said and sharing them with people. And it's a non-threatening way also. We need to be patient in pre-evangelism, avoidance of food or drink which would offend. I'm thinking of alcohol in particular comes to my mind. And of course, non-halal foods, haram foods, which would be pork. We all are pretty familiar with that. And a willingness to establish friendships. It's a long-term process. There's another book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. I believe the author's name is Nabil Qureshi, a young American Muslim. I believe his parents came from Pakistan, if I remember correctly. And through patient evangelism, he became a believer in the Lord Jesus and worked for Ravi Zacharias' ministry. An excellent book that I would highly recommend. There's a quote from Ron Rhodes from Reasoning from the Scriptures with Muslims. More than one Christian missionary has noted that there seem to be very few converts from Islam to Christianity. Yet, as others note, Muslim conversions are few, not because Muslims are so hard to convert, but because they have been largely ignored by the Christian church. Not only are there too few Christian missionaries evangelizing Muslims in other countries, there are far too few Christians seeking to reach Muslims in our own country. This should not be. We must boldly tell the truth about Jesus to our Muslim acquaintances and pray mightily that God would work in the hearts of those we speak to. We can praise the Lord that even now there are Muslims coming to know Christ every day. And I would expand on this by saying that we really do have a mission field on our doorstep. I've said that about the Jehovah's Witnesses and about the Mormons because they actually come to our doors and we should be prepared and not send them away. And the same is true of Muslims. While they aren't going to come to our door, they are coming to our country. And rather than look at it with great fear, even though mortal fear is certainly warranted, but rather than looking at it with fear, I think we should look at it as an opportunity to befriend a Muslim family, and to minister to them and to eventually share the gospel with them in a loving way. We have to remember that the Lord didn't die just for you and me. He died for each and every Muslim out there also. Random thoughts. Now, if I were in a public arena, which I am not, I'm in my home, we would be having a conversation about some of these random thoughts. But there are things that came to my mind as I was working on this, and I'd like to share them with you. First bullet. Because women have virtually no voice in Islam, they cannot counterbalance the aggressive nature of men with the women's less aggressive and more nurturing nature. It seems to me that their lack of a private and public voice also contributes to violence in Muslim majority societies and at times to cruelty in the home. I have even read stories. An example would be Not Without My Daughter, which is in my bibliography also, talking about the cruelty within the Muslim home, woman to woman. Second bullet. With men able to have as many as 4 wives, that leaves many men unable to find a legitimate wife. It would seem to me that having so many young unmarried men of marrying age would only swell the ranks of the jihadists. Also, it helps explain the need for capturing infidel women as sex slaves, some to marry if they convert and some not, and the use of young boys in some Muslim communities and countries. The Mormons have the angel Moroni, who allegedly visited Joseph Smith and gave him the Book of Mormon, which supersedes the Bible. The angel Gabriel, allegedly came to Muhammad and gave him the Quran. Paul states in Galatians 1:8, even though we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to that which we have preached to you, let him be accursed. Both religions approve or have approved of polygamy, and both dismiss the Bible as corrupted. The Watchtower, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower leadership teaches almost exclusively from their own literature, giving only a nod to the Bible, which is their own translation, the New World Translation. Muslims teach heavily from the Hadiths and Sunnahs, which vary among the sects, with relatively few Muslims fluent in Arabic. The leadership, teachers, interpret the Quran as well as the other literature of Islam for their people who are often illiterate and or don't read any Arabic. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2nd edition, says on page 242, the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator, in the first place among whom are the Muslims. These profess to hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us they adore the one merciful God, mankind's judge on the last day. And I hope we have learned from this 4-part series on Islam that the Muslims do not worship the same God that the Christians worship. In 2006, Muslim leaders reached out to the Roman Catholic Pope Benedict XIV with a letter called A Common Word Between You and Us. Christian leaders of many denominations responded in 2008 with a response which, in my opinion, shows their ignorance of Islam. It was signed by many leaders, some with whom we would be familiar. I believe this to be dangerous ecumenicalism. You can look this up online. It was very difficult to find. I had a difficult time finding the list of names who had signed it. And when I found the list of names, I did not print it out. And when I went back to do so, The names that I really wanted to highlight were gone, and it took another long period of searching to get that back again. I find that very curious, but I do actually have a copy here in my home with the names that many of us would be familiar with highlighted. And my last bullet point: biblical evangelical Christianity versus all other world religions and sects is boiled down to grace versus works. The Savior Jesus Christ versus the Savior me, myself, and I. And even in Islam, they are working for their own salvation because they have many, many works to do. They have the 5 pillars they need to adhere to. They are not going to know, except if they're jihadists and they are martyred, they are not going to know until they die and they have experienced judgment whether they're going to go to heaven or go to hell. And I'm going to end with a true story. Jenny Hovsepian wrote a book called Two Great Men Who Changed Our World Forever. She is an Egyptian Christian who has lived in the Middle East. I believe she's American now, or at least lives here. I'm not exactly sure. Oh, Egyptian American. Yes, I see. I'm sorry. She was back visiting a market in the Middle East. She does not give the country, and she had the following encounter. As soon as I entered the market, a handsome, tall guy in his 20s, dressed in a white galabaya, approached me saying, "Say, God is great." I repeated after him, "Allahu Akbar," which simply means God is greater or great. He grinned but quickly told me, "But you do not love Muhammad." I replied, "I love Jesus." "But your book prophesies about Muhammad." Muslims teach that there are 3 verses in the Bible that speak of Muhammad. I said, "Oh, really? Where?" Long silence. "I don't know. I've never seen a Bible." "Would you like to read it?" "I don't have one." "Would you read it if you had one?" "How could I get one? There are no Bibles here." "If I gave you a Bible, would you like to read it?" "How could you get it? How could you get me one? In all of this country you cannot buy a Bible." "I will give you one if you promise to read it and show me the passage that speaks of Muhammad." I dug in my bag and got out a Bible I happened to have with me. He took the Bible as if he were receiving a great treasure he never expected, and began thanking me over and over. But at that very moment, another young man, about his own age, also dressed in a white galabaya, grabbed the Bible from his hands, and the 2 young men got into a fist fight, each saying, "This is mine." "No, it is mine." "I want it." "No, I want it." Worried that they might escalate in their fight, I stepped forward to where a crowd of spectators had gathered by now and said to the intruder, "Please let him have his Bible. I will get you one also." He let go and asked me, "When?" I said, "Tomorrow." "Where?" "Right here." I told him I'd be there, but before I started to leave, a very short old man with gray hair spoke to me. "All my life I have wanted to read this book, and now you are giving away 2, but I still don't get to read it." I said, "Friend, don't worry. I will buy you one too." I turned around and headed home with one thing on my mind. Tomorrow those thirsty souls will get their Bibles. At home, excited, I started wrapping some Bibles. They are illegal. The following day I headed to the market to give the Bibles to the 2 men, plus any others who might want one. No sooner did I arrive than a bearded man dressed in white came toward me screaming, "Kill her! Kill her!" I then went closer to the man who wanted me killed and said, "Friend, why do you want to kill me?" "Because you are distributing Bibles." "Well, do you know what the Bible says?" Total silence. By that time a large crowd had gathered around us, so I started reciting the words of Jesus in Arabic. "You have heard that it was said to you, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. And whoever hits you on the cheek, offer him the other also. Be merciful just as your Father who is in heaven is merciful." The dead silence and peaceful looks on the listeners' faces made me think there would be a great response to the words of Jesus, and maybe there was. But after I finished, the angry man dressed in white came very close to me, got his knife out of its sheath, placed the tip against my stomach, and viciously shouted, "Kill her." I felt the knife and thought the time had come for me to meet Jesus, whom I serve. I said this quick prayer: "Lord, if he kills me, would you please build your church here in this marketplace where my blood is spilled? Strangely, I was not afraid. Suddenly, a police officer appeared and grabbed the man by his two arms, saying, "Leave the lady alone." Relieved from the knife, I realized what was happening. I looked around and found the scared crowd moving away, and I too started walking away. Sad and despondent, I walked toward home. When I had walked a few blocks, I looked behind and spotted the old man who had asked for a Bible. He came nearer and in a hushed voice asked me, "Did you bring me a Bible?" I said, "Yes." He whispered, "Wrap it." I said, "It is wrapped." I got the package out and gave it to him. I will never forget how the old man hugged the wrapped Bible to his chest and kept repeating, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," and then he walked away. I never saw that man again, but I have often asked the Lord to let me meet him in heaven. I do not know if the young man read the Bible or if he ever shared it with the other young man who fought him for it. I do know that they both desired to read it and learn about Jesus, and I have prayed that both would find him throughout its pages. Jesus says in Matthew 5, verses 43 through 48, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, in order that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax gatherers do the same? And if you greet your brothers only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect, mature, complete, as your heavenly Father is perfect." I hope that you have enjoyed this four-part series on Islam, world religion, political, and military system. I hope that you've learned about the doctrines of Islam. I hope you've learned something about the way the people think, what they believe. Some of it might be extra Quranic and some not. I pray that you've learned about their history, our combined history, and how it's affecting the West today. Please pray for all Muslims. Please recognize and remember that we are to love them as Christ loves us. And before I sign off, I just want to remind you that if you're interested in any of the handouts that have been referenced throughout this four-part series on Islam, simply email me at this address. You do not need to be specific about which handout you'd like. They'll just all be in the email and PDF form, as well as my bibliography. And I will also remind you that the bibliography is fairly extensive, and I've put in bold those items that I believe are particularly important into the study of Islam and that aren't too terribly deep, because some really are a little bit dense. God bless you all, and I will pray that you run across a Muslim as I pray for myself, and we'll be able to effectively share Christ with him through our witness. God bless you.